The lights dimmed as Mitch McConnell stepped to the podium. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, a mixture of nervous excitement and inevitable dread. This was it, the moment that would define the future of wealth in America. McConnell, the architect of the system that kept the rich richer and the poor struggling, adjusted his tie, his face as smug as ever. He smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I've won." Again. Behind him, the giant screen flashed his name in bold letters. Mitch McConnell, defender of the elite. He launched into his spiel about the greatness of the American economy, how tax cuts for the wealthy spurred job creation, and how wealth inequality was just a myth created by the radical left. The crowd murmured, but one figure in the back of the room was unshaken. Bernie Sanders, standing tall and resolute, his eyes sharp and focused. For years, he had seen the pain, the real pain, that McConnell and his ilk had inflicted on the American people. He had watched as McConnell smiled with his cronies, as they stripped away opportunities for the working class, as they championed a system designed to keep them at the bottom. And now, it was his turn. Bernie's hand gripped the lectern, his voice calm, but filled with the weight of truth. "Let me tell you something, Mitch," he said, cutting through McConnell's polished rhetoric. "What you call job creation is nothing more than the exploitation of hardworking Americans to line the pockets of the wealthy elite." The room fell silent. "You've had your chance, Mitch," Bernie continued, his voice gaining momentum, "and you've used it to destroy the very foundation of this country. You and your rich friends, sitting in your mansions, sipping champagne, while the rest of us struggle to make ends meet. You call this success?" McConnell's face froze, a thin smile replaced with a look of disbelief. The camera caught his eyes narrowing. He tried to regain composure, but the damage had already been done. The air in the room thickened, a palpable tension rising. Bernie's words hung in the space like a bomb waiting to go off. But what happened next sent shockwaves through the nation, leaving the world holding its breath. The debate wasn't just about numbers or policies. It wasn't about economics in the sterile, academic sense that so many politicians like to pretend it was. This was about something deeper, something more visceral, a fight for the soul of America. The tension in the room was thick. Outside, the streets of every major city were alive with protests, marchers demanding better wages, access to healthcare, a system that worked for all, not just the privileged few. Millions of people, working day in and day out, were being left behind. America, once the land of opportunity, had become a place where the dream was slipping away. Wealth inequality wasn't just a statistic anymore, it was a living, breathing monster in the room. The richest 1% of Americans now owned more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. And while McConnell and his fellow elites had made their fortunes off the backs of hard-working families, the vast majority of Americans were stuck in a vicious cycle of stagnating wages, crippling student debt, and an economy that didn't care if they lived or died. But it wasn't just about money. It was about power. The ability to shape the future of the country, to decide who gets to thrive and who gets to suffer. And Mitch McConnell, as Senate Majority Leader, had spent decades defending the system that perpetuated this inequality. Every decision he made, from tax cuts for the rich to the deregulation of corporations, widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots. In the shadows of his political career, communities of color, immigrants, the working class, the American people, had been left to pick up the pieces. From Flint, Michigan, to the rusting steel towns in the Midwest, it was the people who paid the price. Yet, McConnell stood tall, defending a system that benefited him and his donors. To him, the growing divide between the rich and poor was just collateral damage in the pursuit of maintaining power. But Bernie Sanders wasn't here for the status quo. He wasn't here to play the game McConnell and his rich friends had rigged. For Bernie, this wasn't about winning points in a debate or scoring political capital. This was about the future of America, about the values that defined it. Bernie's fight was personal. He had spent his entire life fighting for those who had been left behind, immigrants, veterans, working-class families, the elderly, and the millions who struggled every day to make ends meet. To him, wealth inequality was a moral issue, not just an economic one. It was about justice, dignity, and giving every American a fair shot, no matter where they were born or how much money they had. And now, here they were, two men, representing two completely different visions for America. McConnell's vision was one where the wealthy got wealthier and everyone else stayed in their place. He had spent his career defending the interests of the top 1%, but that system was crumbling. The protests, the anger, the disillusionment, it was all a sign of a system on the verge of collapse. The country was teetering on the edge, and the people were demanding change. But Bernie's vision was one where everyone could have a shot at the American dream, where healthcare wasn't a privilege, where college wasn't a lifetime of debt, where wages matched the cost of living. It was a vision of an America that was built on fairness and opportunity, not greed and corruption. And now, the stage was set. This wasn't just another debate. This was the fight of a generation. What happens next could change the way you view America's future. But while Bernie was prepared to fight for the people, Mitch McConnell had something else in mind. Mitch McConnell had always been a man of privilege, born into wealth, nurtured by the establishment, and groomed to carry the torch for those at the top. His rise in politics wasn't about fighting for the people, it was about preserving a system that allowed him and his friends to get richer while the rest of America was left in the dust. McConnell's early years were shaped by the elite. The son of a wealthy businessman, he attended the finest schools, moving through life with a sense of entitlement that few could match. His first political victory came at the age of 34, when he won a seat in the U.S. Senate in 1984. But it wasn't his charisma or his ability to connect with the people that propelled him to power, it was his deep ties to the wealthy donors and corporate interests that backed his campaign. In the years that followed, McConnell became known for his unwavering loyalty to the top 1%. He didn't represent Kentucky, he represented the corporate elite who were more concerned with tax cuts than the lives of the working-class people who had put him in power. As Senate Majority Leader, McConnell's true agenda became crystal clear. He didn't pass bills to help struggling Americans. No, McConnell's focus was on ensuring the rich got richer. His biggest achievement was leading the charge to pass the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a sweeping overhaul that benefited the wealthiest Americans and corporations. It was sold to the public as a plan to boost jobs and the economy, but in reality, it did the exact opposite. The rich received massive tax breaks, while the working class saw little to no benefit. The wealth gap only grew wider. But this was McConnell's sweet spot. The more he protected the interests of the wealthiest, the more power he gained. The more he fought for tax cuts for billionaires, the more corporate America flowed money into his campaign coffers. It was a cycle, a corrupt, self-serving cycle, that kept McConnell and his cronies at the top. Meanwhile, the country around him was crumbling. Wages stagnated, healthcare costs soared, and the American dream slipped further out of reach for millions of working-class families. It didn't matter to McConnell. The system worked for him. The system worked for his donors. And as long as he kept the status quo intact, he didn't care who suffered. McConnell's refusal to address wealth inequality wasn't a mistake, it was a calculated move. He knew that confronting the issue would mean disrupting the very system that had gotten him into power. So, he ignored it. He laughed it off. When confronted with the rising tide of protests demanding change, he dismissed them as radical or unrealistic. The idea that everyone deserved an equal shot at success, real, meaningful change, was too much of a threat to the system he'd spent decades building. McConnell wasn't just defending tax cuts for the rich. He was defending an entire political and economic system that kept the wealthy in control while the rest of America was kept in its place. He stood firm against efforts to increase the minimum wage, to provide affordable healthcare, or to reform the financial system. Why? Because it wasn't in his best interest. It wasn't in the best interest of his donors. It wasn't in the best interest of the few powerful elites who pulled the strings behind the scenes. And while McConnell rubbed elbows with the richest Americans, billionaire donors, CEOs, and political megadonors, he showed no interest in understanding the struggles of the working-class people he was supposed to represent. He ignored their calls for help, dismissed their cries for dignity, and turned his back on the very foundation of what made America great, the belief that anyone, regardless of their background, could rise up and succeed. But McConnell's indifference to the suffering of millions wasn't just heartless, it was dangerous. It was a betrayal of the promise of America itself. It was a betrayal of every single person who worked hard, paid taxes, and played by the rules, only to watch the rich get richer while their wages stagnated and their opportunities vanished. McConnell's long tenure as Senate Majority Leader had cemented him as the face of an elite-controlled government, a government that worked for the rich and powerful, but not for the people. And the longer he stayed in power, the more entrenched this system became. But little did Mitch McConnell know, Bernie Sanders was about to expose the heart of his empire. Bernie Sanders didn't come from wealth, privilege, or political connections. He wasn't born into the halls of power like Mitch McConnell. His rise to prominence was forged through the sweat of hard work, the struggles of his working-class roots, and an unwavering belief that the American dream should be accessible to everyone, not just the rich and powerful. Born in 1941 in Brooklyn, New York, Bernie was the son of a Polish immigrant who had worked hard to provide for his family, and a mother who instilled in him the values of community, equality, and justice. The Sanders family wasn't wealthy by any means. They lived modestly, scraping by, but they never went without the essentials. Bernie saw firsthand what it meant to work hard for a living, to stretch every dollar just to make ends meet. It was in this environment that his commitment to social justice and economic fairness took root. As a young man, Bernie saw the world around him and knew something was wrong. The system was stacked against the average person. Inequality was rampant. The rich were getting richer, while the working class was left behind. The promise of equal opportunity that had been sold to so many seemed like a cruel joke. But Bernie wasn't willing to accept it. He wasn't going to sit back and watch the American dream slip away for those who worked the hardest. In the early years of his life, Bernie worked odd jobs to support himself. He worked on construction sites, in kitchens, and even as a carpenter's assistant. His experience in these tough, physically demanding jobs gave him a first-hand understanding of what it meant to struggle, to put in the hours, and to still come home with little to show for it. These jobs weren't just about earning money, they were about survival. They were about dignity. And it was this understanding that would shape his politics for the rest of his life. Bernie eventually left Brooklyn for the University of Chicago, where he became actively involved in social justice movements during the 1960s. It was a time of tremendous social change. The civil rights movement was in full swing, and the fight for equality and justice was at the forefront of the national conversation. Bernie wasn't just an observer, he was an active participant, marching in the streets, protesting injustice, and standing up for the oppressed. He witnessed firsthand the inequality that plagued America, and he saw how systemic forces kept certain groups of people at a disadvantage, while others prospered. This experience ignited a fire in Bernie that would drive him for the rest of his life. After college, Bernie moved to Vermont, a state that would become his political home. He started his political career as an independent, running for local office. At the time, Vermont was known for its small-town, conservative values, and Bernie wasn't exactly the kind of candidate you'd expect to win. But he wasn't deterred. He ran on a platform of progressive values, universal health care, fair wages, environmental justice, and, most importantly, the belief that the government should serve the people, not the wealthy elites. In 1981, Bernie was elected mayor of Burlington, Vermont, becoming the first independent to hold such an office in a major U.S. city. In Burlington, Bernie's politics came to life. He was a champion for the working class, fighting for affordable housing, environmental protections, and greater public services. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. Bernie made it clear that his loyalty wasn't to the wealthy donors or corporate interests that controlled so much of American politics. His loyalty was to the people, the ordinary folks who were working hard every day to survive. From Burlington, Bernie's political journey only grew. He became a U.S. congressman in 1991, and later, a senator in 2007. Throughout his career, Bernie refused to be swallowed by the Washington establishment. He maintained his independence, consistently speaking out against the influence of money in politics, and the corporate corruption that had infected the government. He fought for policies that would benefit the working class, not the elite. His message of economic justice resonated deeply with millions of Americans who had felt invisible for far too long. But it wasn't just about the policies, it was about who Bernie Sanders was. He wasn't a polished politician. He wasn't a careerist who played the game to stay in power. Bernie spoke directly to the people. He was unfiltered, passionate, and unwavering in his commitment to justice. His authenticity set him apart from the rest. When Bernie spoke, it wasn't just his voice that was heard, it was the voice of every single person who had ever been ignored, left behind, or told that their struggles didn't matter. Over the years, Bernie became the most consistent voice in Washington for fighting income inequality, pushing for universal healthcare, advocating for free public education, and tackling climate change. His historic presidential campaigns in 2016 and 2020 were fueled by the belief that the American people deserved better. Bernie's calls for a political revolution were met with enthusiasm from millions of Americans, particularly young people, who saw in him a champion for their future. He wasn't just offering policies, he was offering hope. But Bernie's fight wasn't easy. He faced relentless opposition from both sides of the political aisle, corporate-backed politicians who had no interest in changing the system that benefited them. The media dismissed him, the establishment ignored him, and the powerful worked tirelessly to silence him. Yet, despite the obstacles, Bernie continued to fight. He knew that if the system didn't change, the American dream would continue to fade for those who needed it most. Bernie Sanders wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for millions of Americans who've been ignored for far too long. The debate was well underway, the tension palpable as the two political heavyweights squared off in front of an eager audience. The stakes had never been higher. The future of America, its economic system, its core values, and its very soul, hung in the balance. Mitch McConnell stood firmly at his podium, a polished politician with decades of experience in the halls of power. His voice, calm and measured, echoed through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "let me remind you that the foundation of this great country has always been free markets. It is capitalism that has lifted millions out of poverty. Lower taxes for corporations mean more jobs. More jobs mean more opportunity for every American." He paused, allowing his words to settle into the crowd, and then he delivered his signature line with the kind of smug confidence that had made him the embodiment of Washington's establishment. "The government does not create prosperity. The people do. And it is by protecting our most successful businesses that we create the conditions for that prosperity." The audience, a mixture of supporters and skeptics, murmured in agreement, or disdain. But there was no denying the weight of McConnell's words. He had crafted the narrative that the market was the solution, that wealth should be hoarded by the rich in the name of progress. He had sold the myth of trickle-down economics for decades, and in his eyes, it had worked. The stock market was booming, corporate profits were at an all-time high. What else was there to discuss? But Bernie Sanders wasn't buying it. The moment Bernie stood up to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. There was no formal introduction, no pleasantries. Bernie didn't need any of that. His voice was a clarion call to anyone who had ever been left behind. "What Mitch McConnell is selling," Bernie began, "is the same tired line that's been used for decades. Tax cuts for the rich, deregulation for the corporations, and the idea that somehow, someway, those at the top will trickle down their wealth to the rest of us. Well, it's a lie. A lie that has destroyed the lives of working-class families across this country." Bernie's words were cutting, unrelenting. The audience leaned forward, drawn in by the sheer power of his message. "You talk about prosperity, Mitch," he continued, "but what about the millions of Americans who haven't seen a real wage increase in over 30 years? What about the single mother who works 2 jobs and still can't afford healthcare for her children? What about the veterans who come home from war, only to find that the system they fought to protect has left them behind? McConnell shifted uncomfortably at his podium, a faint flicker of irritation in his eyes. Bernie wasn't following the script. He wasn't reciting the party lines. He wasn't just talking about tax cuts or numbers, he was talking about people. And that was something McConnell couldn't ignore, because it was the one thing he couldn't argue against. But McConnell wasn't done yet. With the same smirk that had carried him through decades of Washington power plays, he fired back. Bernie, you're living in a fantasy world. The government does not solve problems. Private businesses do. The free market is what has made America the greatest country in the world. Your vision of big government intervention and handouts is not the answer. The room was silent for a moment, and then the tension snapped. The contrast between the two men could not have been starker. McConnell's polished rhetoric, dripping with corporate-backed assurances, stood in direct opposition to Bernie's raw, unapologetic truth. Bernie wasn't just criticizing policy, he was attacking the very heart of a system that McConnell had spent his life protecting. Bernie leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on McConnell. You want to talk about the free market, Mitch? Bernie's voice was steady, but there was a fire in it now. The free market doesn't care about people like me and you. It doesn't care about the families struggling to pay their bills. It doesn't care about the kids living in poverty, or the elderly who can't afford their prescriptions. What the free market cares about is profit. And as long as we allow billionaires and corporations to control this economy, those profits will come at the expense of every working-class person in this country. The room was buzzing now. Bernie's words were resonating. He wasn't just speaking to McConnell, he was speaking to the millions of people who had been left behind by the very system McConnell defended. It wasn't just a debate, it was a battle for the future of America. McConnell's face tightened. He was visibly rattled now, his calm demeanor cracking. He had expected Bernie to be just another talking head, a far-left, idealistic senator with nothing more than rhetoric. But Bernie was different. Bernie wasn't just another voice in the crowd, he was the voice of the people McConnell had ignored for years. But Bernie wasn't done. He wasn't here to play by McConnell's rules. With a final jab, Bernie delivered his next line, and it landed like a punch to the gut. The truth is, Mitch, you're not interested in making America great again. You're interested in keeping it great for the rich and powerful. And that's why, no matter what you say, I will always stand with the people. And you will stand with the billionaires who are doing everything they can to ensure that we stay at the bottom. McConnell's eyes flickered. For the first time in the debate, he looked unsettled, and the audience could feel it. Bernie Sanders wasn't just debating him. He was dismantling everything McConnell had spent a lifetime building. But what Bernie Sanders said next, left McConnell reeling and the audience in disbelief. The debate had reached a boiling point, the air thick with tension as McConnell's smug confidence began to crumble under the weight of Bernie's unyielding attacks. It was clear now, this wasn't a contest of words. It was a battle for America's future, a fight between two opposing visions of the country. And Bernie Sanders was about to land the blow that would shake the foundations of the entire debate. McConnell, visibly shaken, tried to regain control. His hands gripped the sides of the podium as he took a breath, his eyes narrowing. Let's be clear, Bernie, he said, his voice laced with irritation. You can keep blaming corporations and the wealthy for all of society's problems, but the truth is, the American economy is thriving. The markets are strong, jobs are plentiful, and the rich are investing in our future. The question isn't about inequality, it's about opportunity. And we give people that opportunity by empowering businesses to grow. The words hung in the air, his arrogance draping over the stage like a veil, but something about the way Bernie looked at him, calm, unfazed, like a man who had been waiting for this moment his entire life, made McConnell's words feel hollow. Opportunity. Bernie's voice cut through McConnell's defense like a knife. Mitch, don't you dare talk about opportunity when millions of Americans are struggling to get by. You call this economy thriving, but you ignore the fact that wages have been stagnating for decades. You ignore the fact that the top 1% has captured nearly all of the economic gains over the last 40 years. And you certainly ignore the truth that, while you've been cutting taxes for the wealthy, millions of working families are working harder than ever and still can't afford basic necessities. The crowd fell into a stunned silence, but Bernie wasn't finished. His words had weight, and every sentence felt like a hammer strike against the status quo. "Let me give you some facts, Mitch, since you seem to have forgotten them," Bernie continued, pulling up a set of statistics from his pocket, figures that had been burning a hole in his mind for years. Between 1979 and 2019, the wealth of the richest 1% grew by more than 300%. Meanwhile, the wages of the bottom 90% of Americans grew by just 26%. 26%. Is that what you call a thriving economy, Mitch? McConnell stiffened, but Bernie pressed on, each word sharper than the last. "And let's talk about what happens when the wealthiest capture the lion's share of this country's resources. We've seen what happens. Corporations move jobs overseas, they cut wages, and they get richer, while the people who keep this country running, the teachers, the nurses, the factory workers, are left behind." Bernie's voice grew stronger, more impassioned. "You say the rich are investing in our future, but where are the investments in our schools? Where's the investment in our healthcare system? Where's the investment in our infrastructure? The truth is, Mitch, the only thing the rich are investing in is more ways to protect their wealth and power, while working families just trying to make a decent living, are left to fend for themselves." The room was dead silent now, save for the sound of Bernie's voice, which had become a force of nature. "And let me remind you, Mitch," he said, his tone firm but not shouting, "there is one thing that wealth inequality does to this country that you simply cannot ignore: it erodes our democracy. When the wealthy control more and more of the country's resources, they also control the political system. They control the media, they control elections, and they control policies that benefit them while leaving the rest of us powerless." At this point, McConnell's face had lost all color. He was no longer the seasoned politician, the man who had weathered political storms and come out victorious. He was just another man, caught in a web of truth he had spent decades trying to hide from. Bernie had torn down his defenses with a calm, calculated precision, and it was clear that McConnell had no answer to the accusations being laid at his feet. "People across this country, immigrants, workers, students, are demanding a change," Bernie said, his voice steady now, the crowd hanging on his every word. "They are tired of the system that puts corporate profits over their well-being. They are tired of watching their wages stagnate while the richest Americans build empires. They are tired of a government that works for the wealthy and leaves everyone else behind. And what Mitch McConnell doesn't understand, what he refuses to understand, is that this fight isn't just about policies. It's about whether or not we are willing to give every American the opportunity to succeed, regardless of where they come from or how much money they have." Bernie took a slow breath and looked directly at McConnell, his eyes filled with the weight of his words. "You may have spent decades building a system that works for the rich and powerful, Mitch. But I am here to tell you that system is coming to an end. The American people are waking up, and they are not going to sit by while the rich continue to get richer and the rest of us continue to struggle." The silence in the room was deafening. The tension had reached its peak, and it felt as though the entire nation was holding its breath. For a moment, there was no applause, no cheers, just the powerful stillness of truth hanging in the air. And then, slowly, the crowd began to stir. A few tentative claps at first, followed by an eruption of applause that filled the room. Some cheered, some stood, some were speechless, but there was no denying the overwhelming sense of triumph that filled the space. Bernie Sanders had delivered his mic drop moment. McConnell, his face pale, stood frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words that would never come. But even as Bernie's words echoed through the halls, the aftermath was even more shocking than the debate itself. The moment the debate ended, the room was still electric. It wasn't just the applause that was deafening, it was the realization that something seismic had just happened. Bernie Sanders had just delivered a blow that would ripple across the country, sparking a wave of energy, frustration, and hope. Within seconds, social media erupted like a volcanic explosion. On Twitter, hashtags like #BernieMicDrop and #EndWealthInequality began to trend worldwide. Every corner of the internet was alive with reactions, millions of voices finally finding the courage to speak up against the system that had kept them silent for so long. People from every corner of America, from the bustling streets of New York City to the quiet rural towns in the South, shared their thoughts. #BernieMicDrop surged to the top of Twitter's trending list as commentators, politicians, and everyday people flooded the platform with their praise. Did Bernie just single-handedly destroy the billionaire class? #BernieMicDrop fire fire fire, one tweet read, quickly amassing thousands of likes and retweets. Others shared clips of Bernie's calm, collected takedown of McConnell, commenting on the chilling precision with which he dismantled decades of corporate-driven policy. One of the top posts read, "Bernie Sanders said what we've all been thinking but were too afraid to say. We deserve more." #BernieMicDrop. The impact wasn't just confined to the digital world. Commentators on major news outlets were losing their minds over what they'd just witnessed. On MSNBC, the usually composed anchor couldn't hide his astonishment. "I've been covering politics for decades, and I've never seen anything like that," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Bernie Sanders just exposed McConnell's entire career. And the way he tied corporate greed to the collapse of democracy? Unbelievable. On Fox News, McConnell's defenders scrambled to play damage control. But even they were struggling to minimize the significance of what had just occurred. "Bernie's rhetoric is idealistic, but it's unrealistic," one pundit said, trying to refocus the conversation, but the tone was defensive, almost apologetic. The typical McConnell talking points were suddenly falling flat. People weren't listening. They were questioning. Bernie Sanders may have just turned the tide for millions of people who have been left behind by the political elite, another commentator said, shifting focus to the long-term impact. "This isn't just a debate victory, it's the beginning of a revolution in how we see wealth and power in this country." On Reddit, users began posting memes at lightning speed. A popular image showed Bernie's mic drop moment with the caption, "When you hit them with facts and they have no response," followed by an explosion of fire emojis. The subreddit r/political revolution saw a surge in new posts, with users sharing their excitement, many of them noting how Bernie's words had reignited a fire in them. "This is why we fight," one comment read. "Bernie is speaking for all of us." But it wasn't just online chatter. The debate sparked real-world reactions, too. In cities across the country, spontaneous rallies began to form, with supporters of Bernie Sanders gathering outside town halls, government buildings, and even McConnell's Kentucky office, chanting slogans like, "We the people, not the wealthy," and "End corporate greed." The contrast between Bernie's vision of a more equitable America and McConnell's defense of the status quo had never been clearer. A narrative was emerging, one where McConnell's defense of corporate power was starting to look more like a defense of the status quo, a system that had long worked for the elite but had left millions of ordinary Americans behind. As the days went on, more and more people began to question McConnell's allegiance to the American people. Was he really fighting for the interests of his constituents? Or was he just protecting the interests of the corporations and billionaires who funded his political career? Bernie's words, "The free market doesn't care about people like me and you," began to echo in the minds of millions. And in this moment, it was no longer just about policies or debate points. It was about values. It was about fairness. It was about who America was really built for. People started to feel that they weren't just witnessing a debate, they were witnessing the birth of a movement. The message was clear: the system that had been rigged against them for so long wasn't going to stand for much longer. The poor, the middle class, immigrants, people of color, and all those who had been left out of the conversation finally had a voice, and they were rallying behind Bernie. As the week unfolded, media outlets saw a dramatic shift in how the conversation was framed. More than just a political divide, the debate over wealth inequality became a national conversation about justice, dignity, and the kind of country America wanted to be. But even as Bernie's words echoed through the halls, the aftermath was even more shocking than the debate itself. The media buzz was still alive with the echoes of Bernie's mic drop moment, but for Bernie Sanders, the true battle had always been about something bigger than the debate itself. As the cameras continued to roll and the crowds began to disperse, Bernie stood in front of the mic, his face calm but resolute. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Looking out into the audience, Bernie took a moment to gather his thoughts. He had delivered his blow, but now it was time to give the people the real message, the message that would carry this moment forward into something lasting. With his trademark sincerity, he spoke once more, addressing not just the room, but the millions watching across the nation. We all know what we saw tonight wasn't just about two men exchanging words on a stage, Bernie began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. It was about something much deeper. It was about the soul of this country, the very values that make America, America. And let's be clear, the issue of wealth inequality is not just an economic problem, it's a moral one. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd as if trying to connect with every person, to make sure they understood the gravity of what he was about to say. We live in a country where the wealthiest among us have more money than they could ever spend, while millions of working families are struggling to put food on the table. We live in a country where CEOs make hundreds of times more than the workers who build their companies, their cities, their country. We live in a country where children are being born into poverty, where healthcare is out of reach for too many, and where education is a luxury for the few, not the many. The audience was silent, but the intensity of Bernie's words resonated. They weren't just facts. They were a call to action, a demand for change. And yet, in the face of all of this, we have leaders who choose to ignore the suffering of millions. They choose to protect a system that benefits the wealthy and powerful, while leaving the rest of us to fend for ourselves. That is not the America I believe in. Bernie's voice rose, filled with passion and clarity. It's time we recognize that this fight is not just about dollars and cents, it's about human dignity. It's about the simple truth that every person, no matter where they come from, deserves a fair shot at success. It's about making sure that the government serves the people, not the billionaires who buy their way into power. It's about creating a society that works for all of us, not just the few. He let the words sink in, then continued, his tone unwavering. But let me be clear, my friends, this fight is not easy. The forces that have created this inequality are powerful. They will fight us every step of the way. They will use their wealth and influence to try to stop us. But we have something they will never have, the power of the people. The crowd erupted into applause, but Bernie wasn't finished. This movement is not about one man. It's about all of us. It's about every worker who wakes up early to go to a job they can barely afford to do. It's about every family struggling to pay for healthcare. It's about every immigrant who came to this country seeking a better life, only to be told that they don't belong. It's about every single person who has ever felt invisible, left out, or forgotten by the system. Bernie paused, his eyes locking onto the camera. Together, we can change this. Together, we can build a society that lifts people up, not tear them down. Together, we can create an America that reflects our highest ideals, where justice, equality, and opportunity are not just words, but promises that we keep for every American. His message was simple, but it was one that cut to the heart of the issue. This isn't just about fighting for better policies, it's about fighting for the very soul of our nation. We have the power to rewrite the story of America, a story where everyone has the chance to succeed, where the rich don't get richer at the expense of the poor, and where dignity and justice are the cornerstones of our society. The crowd roared in approval, but Bernie's voice softened, becoming a call for unity. We stand at a crossroads, but we must choose the right path. We must stand together. We must fight for the values that bind us all, not the greed and corruption that divide us. If we do that, if we stand united, we will win. And when we win, we will create an America where every person can thrive, an America where no one is left behind. The room buzzed with energy, but Bernie's words lingered in the air, thick with meaning. It wasn't just a victory for Bernie Sanders, it was a victory for everyone who had ever fought for justice, for equality, and for a better tomorrow. And as the world reflected on that fateful debate, Bernie's call to action was heard loud and clear. The battle for a fairer, more just America doesn't end with a debate, it begins with action. We've seen the truth laid bare tonight. We've witnessed the system that protects the few at the expense of the many. And now, it's up to us to decide what kind of country we want to be. Bernie Sanders has shown us the path forward, one that is grounded in justice, equality, and a future where every American, no matter their background, has the opportunity to thrive. But we can't do it alone. We need every single one of you to stand with us, to raise your voice, and to demand change. Now is the time to take a stand. This is our moment to reshape America, to build a society where dignity isn't a luxury but a right. It's time to challenge the status quo. It's time to say enough is enough. Join the movement for justice, equality, and a fairer future. Stand with Bernie. Stand with those who have been ignored, dismissed, and silenced for too long. This is not just a fight for the policies we deserve, it's a fight for the soul of our nation. We have the power to create change. We have the power to break down the walls that have kept so many out. Together, we can build a society that serves everyone, not just the privileged few. So, what will you do? Subscribe, share this message, and be part of the movement that will transform this country. Together, we will fight for a future where equality and justice are not just dreams, but realities. The time for change is now. Will you be a part of it?